Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. Today we're going to be talking about our upcoming severe weather event this week, focused on Tuesday, centered across mostly parts of the Midwest. The SPC has now outlined a Day 3 level 2 out of 5 slight risk in the yellow shaded region you see here, basically northern Illinois and Indiana southwestward into Missouri. Large marginal risk surrounds that. So places like Chicago, Peoria, Springfield, Illinois, St. Louis, down into southern Missouri under the gun for that greatest threat on Tuesday, February 27th. Large marginal risk surrounds that, extending all the way down into eastern Oklahoma, northern Arkansas, and up into Wisconsin and Michigan. So a nice, potent early season event coming in here for this week. The hype train has been chugging along with this event for sure. Several days ago, we saw a lot of hype on social media about this event. It looked like a pretty significant event, but as we know, the models are very fickle. They like to change on a dime, and that's exactly what's happened with this system. Models have gone basically on a roller coaster with this system. We haven't had a lot of agreement, but now models are starting to come into much better agreement, and we're starting to get some more clues about how this event is going to progress. And so I thought it would be good to do a forecast discussion today on the upcoming threat. So we're going to go over some model data. We're going to look at our multiple model scenario here, the NAM, the GFS, and the Euro, and take a look at how the models are handling this system and some of the changes we've seen over the last few days as the models have progressed with time. So let's go ahead and dive right in. First, let's take a look at what's going on right now across the U.S. Here is our 500 millibar map. Not a whole lot going on, mostly zonal or west to east flow across much of the country. A little bit of troughing up here to the north, and a little bit of troughing coming into your screen there off the Baja California coast, that southwesterly flow plume there moving in. So we have kind of two different plumes of our jet stream here, as you see. The northern one, which is what we call our polar jet, it originates closer to the poles, hence the name. And then we have our subtropical jet here, more located off to the south. And these two jets are expected to phase or come together over the next couple of days, and that is expected to impact our severe weather event on Tuesday. Now, the models have not handled this all that well. A few days ago, we had expected a pretty intense phasing of these two jet streams into a very potent trough. That is not so much the case at this point now. They're having a little bit, they've had, at least in the last several model runs, a little bit of trouble phasing together, at least early on in the event. And then later on, as we go into Wednesday morning, they're expected to phase a little bit better together and then come in into configuration of more so a nice trough moving across the northern half of the country. So that has had an impact on how the models are portraying this system. Let's go down to the surface here. Not a whole lot going on as well as you might expect. We have a low up here well off into Canada. Looks like some sort of frontal zone down here draped into the Midwest and into the southern plains. At least some broad surface troughing here as you go into the southern plains, but not a very intense cold front, so we're not going to have any moisture return issues, at least getting the moisture northward. The quality of that moisture is going to be in question, as we'll talk about here in just a bit when we go through the model data. But weak cold front moving through here into the southern plains, but that will allow those winds to back a little bit out here, out ahead of this cold front today, and bring that moisture, start to bring this moisture northward. If we look at our surface observations here across the entire country, you'll see that over here across our target area for tomorrow, only 30s dew points at this point, so very limited moisture up there already. We're going to need to get that moisture up to the north over the next few days, and that should take place pretty easily. But again, the overall quality of the moisture and the real robust moisture getting all the way up there is in question. Looks like we still have those 60s dew points situated far to the south across far southern Texas into the Gulf. We've had a little bit of an intrusion of that drier, cooler air into the Gulf here over the last few days. And so that has allowed those dew points to get swept out into the Gulf just a little bit. But we do have 50s dew points across much of the southeastern half of Texas. And then those are going to, again, start to trickle northward today and continue to go northward into the next couple of days for this event on Tuesday. All right, let's dive into some model data. We're going to look at three different models, the 12Z NAM, the 12Z GFS, and the 6Z Euro. The 12Z Euro not quite in yet as I'm recording this video. We're going to go through some similarities and differences among the models. They're starting to converge into one common solution, but there are still a few slight differences among the timing and placement of some of the features in the models. So we'll go through that and give you kind of a progression of how this setup is going to look going forward through the next couple of days. We'll start off with the 12Z NAM at 500 millibars, and you can see our two different jet streams here. This plume of flow off to the north, this is our polar jet stream, And this plume of flow off to the south with this little trough coming in, this is part of our subtropical jet stream. And again, these two are going to try to phase together over the next couple of days. You see here as we go on with time, as we go into tomorrow evening, Monday evening, you see the two disparate parts of the jet stream here. This trough digging down into the northwest portion of the country, that's associated with our polar jet. And then on this plume of flow here off to the south, that is our subtropical jet. And as we go into the day on Tuesday, those are going to try to phase together, but they're not going to quite complete that phasing. This is 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday evening. We still kind of see two separate parts here, this trough and this plume of flow. And that is going to have some impacts on the overall forcing across the main target area for severe storms going into Tuesday afternoon and evening. And then as you see, as we go into Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, they phase into one single trough here. But by then the severe threat will be winding down. Limited instability for Wednesday. We should have some severe threat moving into Wednesday morning, but that should die down a little bit going into the afternoon on Wednesday, given very limited instability out here across the Ohio River Valley region. But for our event on Tuesday, this phasing not really going to be consummated in full. Let's take a look at the GFS progression here. This as we will go forward with time, and these two are going to try to phase together. There's our trough coming into the northwestern portion of the country, and then our subtropical jet here. This is going to be 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday evening. A little bit more strung out kind of trough here with this polar jet type trough, and then our subtropical jet down here. A little bit different solution than what the NAM was showing. Here we are on Tuesday, a little bit more concise, a little bit better, slightly higher amplified trough with that polar jet moving down with our plume of flow down to the south. A little bit of a difference here as far as the overall progression of this system. But the idea is going to be the same. We're going to have these two separate areas of forcing. This northern one not really going to be in play so much. This is plume from the subtropical jet, really going to be our main forcing mechanism for severe storms, but the overall forcing with it is going to be quite nebulous. We don't really see any real ripples in the flow. I'll zoom in here a little bit to our Midwest sector on both of these. See if we can pick out any features, and I just really don't see much. Again, stronger flow aloft itself can act as kind of a sort of a push broom. It pushes this air out of the way, leaving kind of a void behind it, and then we have rising air that may replace that behind it. But overall, not a whole lot of little shortwaves moving through the flow. A few very subtle ripples here, but overall the synoptic scale forcing looks pretty nebulous with this environment. A little bit of a separate plume of flow here going into the 6 p.m. hour on Tuesday evening. Maybe a little bit of curvature there, but we're picking at straws here. Not a lot of forcing, it looks like, here at 500 millibars. Let's go down. Let's see the GFS as well. And I'm just not seeing a whole lot in the way of synoptic scale forcing until perhaps after 0Z. So this may very well be more of a nighttime evening and nighttime type deal across this region, when we might have a little bit of a shortwave and at least maybe a glancing blow from the trough out here back to the west across this region to fire up a few storms. We're going to have to rely on the cold front, which may mean a little bit messier of a storm mode. We'll take a look at shear vectors here in just a second as far as our orientation to the initiating cold front. But to me, it just looks like the synoptic scale forcing is not all that strong until well after dark. We start to see that trough move in a little bit better, and we'll be in the exit region of this trough pretty firmly by the overnight hours into Wednesday morning. As we go forward here on the NAM as well, you see that kind of coming to fruition as well. Axis of our trough back in here, exit region over here, and that is when we'll see the main dynamics with the main trough start to overtake the region. So as far as daytime storms on Tuesday, definitely a little bit in question. They may start to fire on the cold front. There may be increasing convergence along the surface cold front, which we'll look at here in just a second. But overall synoptic scale forcing is quite weak. So that may be a little bit of a fly in the ointment with this setup, at least for daytime stuff. Let's go down to 700 millibars, see if we can spot any little short waves here going into Tuesday. So again, 700 millibars, we're looking for little ripples in the flow, and this is a little bit interesting. We do see a little bit of curvature here, a little bit more curvature associated with these height contours at 700 millibars on the NAM. So that could be a possible subtle forcing mechanism here for the Tuesday event, at least for daytime stuff. This is at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday. So we'll take a look at the GFS and see if it shows the same thing. Let me back out here real quick and go down to 700 millibars. So NAM showing a little bit of maybe a ripple in the flow. GFS might be showing something similar. A little bit of curvature in the contours there, a little bit of a belt of stronger flow approaching Missouri into southern Illinois by Tuesday afternoon. So that is perhaps something that could set off some storms. At least it will be a very subtle forcing mechanism, so that will be interesting to watch out for. But again, the cold front may be the dominant forcing mechanism associated with this setup. Let's go to the European model now, 500 millibars, see how this model handles the progression of these features. And not looking too different from the other models. Again, there's our plume of the subtropical jet, trough moving in across the northern half of the country. So still a little bit of trouble in phasing these two together by Tuesday evening on the European model. Looks pretty similar to the other 500 millibar progressions. NAM definitely looks to be the least progressive of the bunch. The axis of the trough looks to be back in here, whereas on the GFS, it looks to be perhaps a little bit farther forward, farther to the east, and then the European model maybe a little bit closer to the NAM as far as the timing goes. GFS tends to have a little bit of a progressive bias. NAM and the Euro tend to have a little bit of a slow bias, perhaps at times. So probably somewhere in the middle of these two. Not a whole lot of difference at this point among the timing of these features, but overall the pattern looks kind of the same. This kind of positively tilted trough, subtropical jet plume down here to the south. And that will be kind of leaving a little bit more nebulous forcing here across the Midwest. Perhaps a little bit of a shortwave, though, there at 700 millibars, as we saw on the NAM and GFS. All right, let's go down to the surface, and this is where you'll notice some slightly greater differences among the models. So here's the 12Z NAM surface pattern, and you'll notice that the surface low associated with this event is going to be coming from the northwest. Here's our surface low up here in Canada. And this is not something we often see here in the U.S. Typically, we're talking about lead cyclogenesis here on the Central Plains, east of the Rockies. But that's not the case with this setup. And it makes sense, though, because our main trough is going to be coming in from the northwest, digging down into the northwestern quadrant of the country here. And so that is going to be our main trough, traversing the higher terrain up here in western Canada. And so therefore, we're going to get cyclogenesis east of the higher terrain up there in western Canada, and that surface low is going to drop to the southeast, and that is going to be our main surface feature with this setup. We're going to perhaps get additional cyclogenesis here across the northern plains along the cold frontal zone. You see very cold temperatures off here to the north, these pinks, blues, and grays, very cold air seeping in behind this cold front. But we are going to get a separate surface low to develop, looks like, across the northern plains by early Tuesday morning. And that is going to be our main surface low for the Illinois portion, the portion of the risk area centered on Illinois. And I think that's going to be where our main severe weather threat, or most robust severe weather threat, is going to set up with this event. Is going to be ahead of the surface low. Now, this has changed a little bit. I'm going to zoom in here to our Midwest sector. So here is our surface low located somewhere by, at least on this NAM run, this is 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday evening. Surface low centered up here somewhere in far eastern Iowa, southwest Wisconsin. Cold front draped down to the south. Our main thermal gradient is well back in here, interestingly enough. So a little bit of a different progression here, maybe a little bit of a prefrontal trough associated with this surface low. And then our warm front looks to be out here somewhere, out across the Great Lakes region into Michigan and east. So broad area out ahead of this surface low, but this overall pattern has changed quite a bit here over the last few runs. I'm going to go to our model run comparison tool here from the College of DuPage. So this is our current run, and I'm going to go back a few runs, and you'll notice that the overall surface low did not look as good the last few runs. It looked like a very strung out banana type low, as we call it, very elongated, not really concise surface low. Whereas now, this most recent model run here from the NAM showing a little bit more circular, a little bit tighter surface low up here, and that would have impacts on the low level response. That is going to strengthen and back those winds a little bit better out here, out ahead of the surface low, and that could provide a little bit better low level environment for supercells and perhaps tornadic supercells to thrive out here. But again, I think the main area of interest with this setup is going to be ahead of the surface low, where those winds can be a little bit more backed. And if this NAM solution comes to fruition, that would be a little bit more favorable than what we've seen in some of the past few runs. So interesting trends here with the NAM. Let's take a look at the GFS and see what the GFS is showing. So we'll go forward in time. we'll keep it on the broad view here. You get additional surface cyclogenesis across, looks like eastern South Dakota by early morning on Tuesday. That will drift off to the east. And you'll notice that this is not quite as favorable a look as what the NAM was showing. We'll zoom in here, and we still see a little bit more of this strung out type pattern with the this surface low. If we look at the NAM solution, looks a little bit tighter, a little bit more circular than what the GFS is showing. And so that, again, is going to have impacts on the low-level environment. You'll see the low-level winds here out across Illinois here. This is, again, at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday, a little bit more out of the southwest, which would negate low-level shear a bit and have impacts on perhaps negating a little bit of the tornado threat with any storms that can fire out here. So the overall evolution of the surface low is going to be important. The NAM does tend to be quite aggressive in these scenarios, so we'll have to watch that for sure. And as you see, the GFS is a little bit more progressive with these features. Main thermal gradient somewhere in here. And then on the NAM, it is well back in here. So NAM definitely much slower and less progressive than the GFS, which is a little bit faster, a little bit more strung out surface low here. So GFS not quite as favorable of a solution for robust severe weather. Still would favor severe weather, of course, but not quite as robust as what the NAM is showing, with a tighter, more wound up surface low, a little bit more backed flow out ahead of it across Illinois into Indiana. Let's take a look at the Euro. Same thing here. We'll start off with the broad view. Again, cyclogenesis there across the northern plains Tuesday morning. And this looks a little bit more like the GFS than the NAM. I'm going to zoom in again to our Midwest sector. And you'll see this is at 0Z. That perhaps is the worst look of the three. Very strung out, very banana-esque low there, if you will. So that would not be quite as favorable. We do perhaps have a little bit of a circulation up here across, a little bit tighter circulation there across eastern Iowa. We do see some backed flow out there. That could be along a little bit tough to tell. The warm frontal boundary here on the Euro may be somewhere in this vicinity, a little bit of a pressure tongue there. So that may be associated, this backflow up here in northern Illinois may be associated with the surface low. We'll have to look at that as we go into the moisture parameters. But this surface low, definitely the least appealing of the three. GFS at least has a little bit better structure to it than what the Euro was showing. Euro is just all strung out, would not really favor a concentrated area of robust severe potential. The NAM certainly the best looking of the three at this point. So this is going to be something to watch over the next few days, see if the other models come in line to the NAM solution, which would be the most favorable for robust severe weather out here, especially across northern Illinois ahead of the surface low. Now, moisture is going to be one of the flies in the ointment with this setup. I'm going to go back out to our broad sector here for all of our models, and we're going to have to look at the pivotal weather output for the Euro. The College of DuPage does not have moisture for the European model, so we're going to have to look at the pivotal weather output for the moisture on the Euro model. So here's the NAM, and we'll go to dew points here. And so you see right now our surface dew points, those 60s dew points well out into the Gulf, very, very southern tip of Texas at this point. They're going to start to make their way northward through the day today ahead of this little surface trough / weak cold front helping to strengthen and back those winds out ahead of it, pull those 60s dew points inland into East Texas today. So that will get that'll be a nice head start for this moisture to start getting northward. But because we won't be seeing robust surface cyclogenesis out here across our typical region of the central to southern high plains, that moisture is going to kind of slowly move its way northward instead of more efficiently as if we were to see a surface low out here. But again, our surface low is going to be coming from the northwest and much farther removed from this moisture plume. So the moisture return it's going to happen, but we're not going to get those 60s dew points as far north as we would if we were to have a much more robust low out here out across the central high plains. So you'll see as we go into the day on Monday, those 60s dew points trickle northward, get some 50s up there into the Midwest by Monday evening. Then those 60s dew points kind of evaporate a little bit going into the day on Tuesday. Here we are at 21Z. This is 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. I'll zoom in up here. And you see not all that great moisture up here across the Midwest. Dew points only reaching in the mid to upper 50s across Illinois into Indiana, which is definitely going to be a drawback to this setup. You can see the 60s dew points confined here to Arkansas and Missouri. And this, if there were any solution that was gonna get these 60s dew points up into the Midwest, into our target area for Tuesday, it would be the NAM solution with that stronger surface low. But it's not, doesn't look like that's happening here, and so that is going to be something that may be a fly in the ointment with this setup. A little bit more meager moisture. Now, this time of year, we don't need 65, 70 dew points with these setups, but this is definitely a little bit on the lower side for the somewhat lacking kinematics with this setup. If we had very strong kinematics at play, much stronger trough, negatively tilted trough, we'd be much more in business, so to speak. But with these, with a little bit lackluster kinematics and overall lackluster moisture, that may be a drawback to this overall setup. And so as we go into the evening on Tuesday, those 60s try to make their way northward eventually, but by then the cold front going to be crashing in. You see that cold front by about midnight or so on Tuesday going into Wednesday morning. That cold front just crashes through and will push everything off to the east. Let's go to the GFS. You see here those dew points try to make their way inland today. And then we go into Monday. Those 60 dew points make their way up. We do have a little bit of a plume of 60s dew points there up into Illinois by 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday, which is interesting because the GFS did not have quite as wound up of a surface low, so you'd expect not quite as a little bit less intense moisture return here, but the 60 dew points all the way up into southern Illinois, and that would certainly be interesting if that setup could, if this could verify with the NAM surface low setup. That would be certainly a much more favorable setup for severe weather. A little bit skeptical of this, I have to be honest. Not sure if we'll be able to get 60s dew points, at least widespread 60s dew points all the way up here. Especially if the more weak surface solutions come to fruition. But the GFS is a little bit aggressive with the moisture. Again, the surface pattern a little bit more strung out, a little bit more backed low-level flow, which would negate the low-level shear despite a little bit stronger moisture. So definitely some different drawbacks here with the GFS. But overall, GFS is bringing that moisture northward, those 60s dew points northward. Still on the low side as we get into the spring. We still like to see those dew points up into the low to mid 60s for really robust events. But overall, this would still support severe weather. I'm not saying that these dew points here, if the NAM were to come to fruition, would not support severe weather. They certainly would, just maybe not quite as robust as if we were to have a little bit better moisture. European model here on Pivotal weather. Again, this is going to be the 0Z output. The 6Z outlook, or the model run of the Euro, is paywalled. So we'll look at this 0Z. Shouldn't be much change here. You still see a little bit of a strung out low there out across much of the Midwest. Very banana-esque low with the Euro. And the Euro definitely struggling to bring those 60s dew points all the way up into Illinois. Some patchy blues there. You see some patchy 60s, maybe right around 60, but mostly mid to upper 50s across this region, siding with the NAM, as it looks like on the Euro. So let's take a few soundings here. We'll start off at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time here. I'll take one just ahead of the surface low out here, maybe western Illinois, to start off with, just to take a look at what we might see here. A little bit different placement on the GFS for sure, a little bit more progressive again with those surface features on the GFS, so a little bit displaced off to the east from what the NAM is showing. So this is the NAM solution, 3 p.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday. And here is our thermodynamic profile. Definitely on the weaker side. Mixed layer CAPE only approaching about 700 joules per kilogram. We do have a little bit of a warm nose, it looks like, here just above 850 millibars that may thwart convection a little bit. And that is the problem with having a little bit less favorable kinematics at play. Because we don't have strong forcing, the trough displaced off to the west, and that trough as it is very positively tilted, kind of strung out. So if we had really strong forcing in here, nice negatively tilted trough, that warm nose would be able to erode pretty quickly, and that would not be too much of an issue. But here, because we don't have all that strong of synoptic scale forcing, that is going to be a little bit difficult to erode, especially if we have quite a bit of cloud cover in the warm sector come Tuesday afternoon. 65 over 59 at the surface, so again, that's why we don't need 65, 70 dew points out here this time of year. So this moisture is still certainly adequate. I do wonder if the NAM is a little bit on the cool side. Let's take a look. I just want to take a quick look back at surface temperatures here and what these models are showing. So the GFS definitely a little bit on the warmer side, so it looks like the NAM is displaying its typical cool bias. Temperatures across Illinois into the low to mid 70s. whereas on the NAM we're only seeing 50s and 60s. So certainly looks to be quite cool, and that would help to negate this little warm nose here. If we were to get it up to 72 degrees or so, we'd be looking at something like that, a little bit better of a profile for robust convective, surface-based convective development. So keep that in mind. The NAM definitely looks like it's displaying its cool bias there with surface temperatures, and that would help negate any impacts from this warm nose aloft. But adequate instability at this point for severe storm development. But again, the overall forcing is a little bit in question. If we can get that 700 millibar shortwave to move in, that might be just enough to get storms to fire out ahead of the surface low there in the western Illinois region. Wind profile is looking pretty good, slightly more backed flow again on the NAM, helping to enlarge those low-level hodographs just a little bit, veering and strengthening of the low-level winds with height, over 200 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. So any storms that can fire in this environment, assuming we don't have the unfavorable thermodynamics in the low levels, would be able to have an all-hazards threat. Now, let's take a look just real quick at the overall orientation of the shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. So it looks like here that we may just be initiating along the cold front. We'll call the cold front the initiating boundary for now, this kind of surface trough cold front feature there. So our cold front drawn in somewhere in this vicinity here. And then let's look at our shear vector orientation with respect to that boundary. Definitely some degree of those wind vectors off of the boundary. Not quite the optimal angle. Looks to be kind of in that gray area between more messy modes and slightly more discrete modes. But for a while, the cold front not going to be plunging all that far to the east until that cold air really starts to sink down. So initially, I think we may see, given the weaker background forcing for ascent, we could see a few discrete storms develop out here out ahead of the cold front and surface low moving off to the east. And then we may get, as the forcing increases into the overnight hours, that could definitely foster an uptick in convective coverage. So back to our sounding here, assuming some semi-discrete storms to start, would have an all-hazards threat, mainly a tornado damaging wind and damaging wind threat, perhaps some large hail initially, some steeper lapse rates aloft associated with what might be an EML plume here. So we could see some large hail, especially if storms are elevated in the first few hours of development, if this little warm nose comes to fruition. Let's see what the GFS is looking like. We do see a little bit of the GFS, a little bit of that warm nose there on the GFS, which may, again, thwart convective development for a little while, push it off into the evening hours. A little bit more instability than what the NAM was showing, given stronger, higher surface temperatures, 70 over 61 here. Again, I think 61 might be a little bit of a stretch as far as dew points go, but if we can realize a little bit higher moisture, that would destabilize the environment a little bit better, a little bit more favorable for robust convective development. 1,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, steep lapse rates aloft with that EML plume there. So with the GFS, again, weaker low-level wind profile, so not quite as much curvature in the low levels of the hodograph. This would be more favorable for large hail with decent instability in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, perhaps slightly elevated convection to start, and a supercell mode with strong deep layer shear for supercells over 50 knots, almost 60 knots of effective bulk shear. With limited low-level shear, that is a recipe for large hail. Now, as we go into the evening hours, let's go toward 0Z here on both of these models. We'll take a sounding from west central Illinois once again on the GFS as well. We'll take one out in here. Again, features are displaced, so GFS a little bit farther off to the east, but the idea is the same. And here we go. This is what could be of interest for Wednesday or Tuesday evening. Again, I think this is too cool. Surface temperature is too cool here across the region. Probably upper 60s to maybe around 70 by this point. This is at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So warmer temperatures. This would negate this little warm nose the NAM is showing here at the surface, and we'd be fully destabilized with a nice-looking wind profile for tornadic supercells. 1,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape. Strong curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph as that low-level cyclone develops. A little bit stronger than the other models, perhaps a little bit of an uptick in the low-level jet there across the region. You see those reds coming in as we go into the evening hours, so stronger low-level flow, a little bit of a strengthening in low-level flow, helping to enlarge hodographs here by evening in north central Illinois. Nice looking veering wind profile with height leading to that curvature in the hodograph in excess of 300 joules or meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. So plenty favorable for tornadic supercells. Now, a little bit of a weakness in the mid-levels of the hodograph. I don't know if that's going to be too much of an issue. Perhaps might have a little bit of an issue where you have your precipitation vented out ahead of these storms, and which may make viewing any tornadic circulations a little bit on the difficult side, given your little bit of backing there in the mid-levels, a little bit of a kink there in the hodograph. But overall, the low-level wind profile and that instability profile certainly favorable for tornadic supercells and some stronger line segments there. At this point, the large hail threat would probably subside unless we still have elevated convection, which doesn't look too likely at this point. So mostly a damaging wind and tornado threat as we go into the evening and overnight hours, Tuesday into Wednesday morning. GFS, we also see a little bit of an increase in the low-level wind profile with the GFS, a little bit more curvature there in the hodograph. Over 200 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. Still some veered low-level winds. That's why we don't have quite as strong of a low-level wind profile with the GFS as we do with the NAM, but still certainly favorable for tornadic activity with these cells. GFS down to 64 at this point, so that the NAM might not be that far off as we get towards sunset here. So that may be a little bit of a bugaboo. Perhaps slightly elevated convection, but again, we've seen with strongly sheared low-level environments that can help drill through that stable layer and persist help any tornadic activity persist despite a little bit of convective inhibition in the low levels. But this is very minimal convective inhibition, if any, so we'll have to keep that in mind for sure. And then as we go into the overnight hours, again, we'll probably see a conglomeration of convection there, and especially as the cold front takes over, going into Wednesday morning, we'll produce a squall line there moving off to the east and southeast, going into the morning hours on Wednesday. So that is going to do it for this video, it looks like. That is pretty much all I have at this time. We'll continue to monitor how these models are changing over the next couple of days. We still don't have quite the agreement that we'd like to see, but we're getting there. Definitely the NAM looks like the most robust solution at this point, with a slightly stronger surface low, a slightly more wound up surface low, which would mean a slightly stronger low-level wind profile. But interestingly enough, it was not advecting those 60s dew points up northward into the northern portions of the slight risk area, which you might expect with a stronger low-level wind profile. So that was interesting to note. GFS was a little bit better with moisture return, even though it did not quite have as strong of a wind profile there. So very interesting to note there as we go into the next couple days. But overall, the message for now is that we have a broad area of severe potential for Tuesday, mostly Tuesday evening into the overnight hours. Convective development on Tuesday afternoon is a little bit in question. We did see a little bit of a shortwave moving in, but it was very subtle. And we may still be capped here across the region, and that might be a little bit stubborn to erode given a weaker synoptic scale forcing for ascent. But nonetheless, we could see severe storm development out here ahead of the surface low, especially across the eastern Iowa, western Illinois vicinity initially, and then things as the cold front takes over, storm coverage will continue to increase along the cold front as it pushes off to the east, going into the evening and overnight hours Tuesday into Wednesday morning. I think the greatest threat for severe potential will be up here across northern Illinois into Indiana. Still not enough uncertainty to warrant an upgrade. We may see an upgrade at some point. Right now, it doesn't. It looks like the slight risk will cover things as we still have some uncertainties in the setup, the thermodynamic profile as we go into the evening on Tuesday, as well as some differences in the surface low and the low-level wind profile among the models. So, well, right now, broad area of slight risk from far southern Wisconsin, southwest Michigan into Illinois, Indiana, down into Missouri, with a marginal risk surrounding that. So if you're in any of these shaded areas, definitely be aware over the next couple of days of the forecast. Prepare for severe weather, and we'll know a little bit more as we go into tomorrow and especially on Tuesday morning. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.